starting here, you'll see lesson 10 for the start. And I had to bring it up on my phone to keep in track all of those that are on the sick list. So we need to remember Dot Fuller. Her surgery went well, but they're going to have to go back and a little bit later and do a scan to make sure everything was taken care of. Lance Outlaw in ICU on the ventilator, some progress. Emma Moody got a good report, but there's still limited activity, and Kevin's waiting on test results. Sheila has, what her email said was something similar to carpal tunnel. It was tarsal, which that just means it's in the foot instead of the hand. So, and Patricia Abrams' father, mother, brother, all diagnosed with COVID. Addison Hall's hip procedure was put on hold. I think the Halls are all doing better. And then Wayne Thorne, friends of the Days, are back home and recovering from COVID. So we need to keep all those folks in our thoughts and prayers, and also always keep Terry in our prayers. Me, I'm not 100% today, so if I start dragging, y'all just keep things going, okay? I think I can't seem to get over what I had 2 months ago. It just seems to want to keep coming back. So, Brother Dave, would you lead us in a prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful that you blessed us with another Lord's Day here upon this earth, that we can gather here and worship Thee, Father. Father, we're also mindful of all those who are visited and sick. We know, Father, that you with their needs. We ask that you stick your hand of mercy down upon them, and whatever their need is at this time, please grant that to them. Whether it's rest or the right medicine or the right procedure, Father. And we know you know best, and you lay things in your hands. As we come before you, Father, to study, let us open your word, know that it's the truth. Through Larry that teaches us, through us that we might have full minds and hearts, the seed might be planted, might use what we learn today to better service of God. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Last week when I said that we would be studying the book of Esther today, and that it was one of my favorites. I have a lot of favorites, but one of my favorites, I saw a lot of people nodding and grinning. So if you've got your hand out, you can just forget the first 2 pages, page 30 and 31, which is the introduction, because I'm going to do my own introduction. The book is titled Esther, but we don't hear about Esther until we get 28 verses into the book. So, when we begin with chapter 1 and verse 1, there is a young lady that is, we'll find that in chapter 2, verse 7, Hadassah. Now, who exactly is Hadassah? And don't say Esther. Who is Hadassah? What's her background? She's a Jew, absolutely. What else? She's an orphan. Anything else? We're gonna cover that, and I think you'll find out it's cousin and not uncle, but okay. Married, unmarried? Unmarried, okay. I'm sorry? Very pretty. Where does she live? Around the palace of Shushan, because that's where Mordecai is. All right. So, she is a young Jewish woman, unmarried, was technically we would call it adopted, but back in those days they didn't go through formal procedures of adoption. They just moved them in and took care of them as if it were one of their own. She was raised by her uncle Mordecai. Now, who exactly is Mordecai? What is his position around the capital of Shushan here? Terry and I were discussing it this morning just a little bit, and I am of the opinion that he was more than likely a eunuch because of his ability to move around and inquire of who would be Esther, her well-being. And it appears as though he may have been employed by the king because he was always hanging around one particular gate, which would also lead then to me to believe that he was possibly the doorkeeper at this location. But he seems to always be in and around the capital. And it never mentions him having a wife. And if we go to chapter 2 and verse 7, where Brother Day had first said uncle and then changed to cousin, it is worded kind of strange, but I think we will find out that it is cousin because it says, and he brought Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So if it's his uncle's daughter, that would make him then to be a first cousin. So, and apparently she was orphaned at a fairly young age because she was not able to take care of herself, that somebody older had to take care of her, which then would mean that Mordecai was older. It also, if you read between the lines on it, it means that she was not a wealthy woman. Her parents were not wealthy and left her anything, or else she could have taken care of herself. But with him being employed by the king in the position around the palace, that leads me anyway to believe that she is of, that they're not of nobility or great means. Now, when we get to verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That is your first question, is how big was his kingdom? And from India to Ethiopia was a large piece of land. 127 provinces mean that there were 127 sultans or sub-sultans who run these areas. So he was over a fair amount of territory and a fair number of people. And then it says that in those days when the king sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, so it narrows it down to the location of Shushan. And then in verse 3, in the 3rd year of his reign, well, you have to go outside Scripture a little bit and go backtracking and adding and all, but this basically puts it down to 483 BC, plus or minus a couple. You know, I don't get dogmatic on time that long ago, but 2,500 years ago, thereabouts. So we're in the neighborhood of 483 BC. Now, the rest of verse 3 is very, very important because it says that he made a feast, and as we learn later, there's going to be another feast, but this particular feast was for the princes, his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of provinces being before him. So this first feast that he is having is for all the nobility. Now, let's back up to verse 1 for just a second. Ahasuerus, is that the name of a person or is that a title? It's a title. When you look at it, it's this particular Ahasuerus, the king, was Xerxes or Xerxes II. He was the son of Darius, and I always want to pronounce it Hysteria, but that's not the way you pronounce his last name. It's Hystasis. Darius Hystasis was his father. So Xerxes II is the king that we're talking about here. Questions or comments then through verse 3?
When we think about it, it talks about how big his kingdom was, and he had 127 provinces, and you have all these nobility coming from each of those provinces. This is a big party.
It is a huge party, and it didn't last overnight. We're going to find out it lasted a while. So when people travel that distance, they don't go for a one-night party and leave. So verse 4, he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. What's 180?
6 months.
I'm sorry? 180. A score is 20. 4 score is 80, so 180 days.
6 months.
6 months. So for half a year, these people got around, and the king fed them and took care of them and showed them. And by him showing off his riches and all, this was not an uncommon practice. They liked to show off what they had. So he does that for 180 days, and when the days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan, the palace, both unto the great and the small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. This is the second feast. This feast lasted 7 days, and it was for all the people that could attend around the area there. So we need to break those two out as we go on down through here. Where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords and fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. He is throwing, as Brother Day had mentioned, for the nobles, a lot of people, and he is throwing a very lavish party for all the people there. Verse 8 is interesting because it says the drinking was according to the law. What is according to the law at one of these functions?
What I understand, you can drink as much as you want or as little as you want. No restrictions for the temple.
Okay. That is partially correct. At some of these functions, well, the next line also says that none did compel, which means what Brother Golden said, that here an exception, one of the laws that could be enforced was that you drink what you want to, you don't have to drink if you don't want to. Another law that they had was if the king drinks, you drink. If you don't drink when the king drinks, you leave. So here he opened it up and said, you only have to drink what you want to drink. And so the king appointed all the officers of his house, and they did according to every man's pleasure. Now in verse 9, it says, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. This one is important because why would the queen make a feast for the women if the king was making a feast for all the people in the garden? All doesn't mean all. Detail.
Women were excluded.
Women were excluded. In the Eastern world, and still today, in most circumstances, men and women don't mingle in public. So here, this great big feast for all, as Brother Day said, was male exclusive. So Vashti then made a party for all the women at a separate location. Then on the seventh day, the last day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, what would be another word for that? Drunk out of his mind, drunk out of his skull. He commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. We just said that men and women didn't mingle in public. So what's the king doing when he is sending for Queen Vashti to come in their presence, to show her off?
Much like the New Testament when Herod had his party. All in things.
He was bringing her in to show her off, which was against tradition, against custom. He was breaking their own laws. Yes, sir.
These 7 guys were probably eunuchs in charge of his cabinet.
More than likely. We're going to get into harems a little bit later. So verse 11, bringing Vashti the queen before him. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Did she have a right to refuse the king? Would be the question. I just said right. You take it from there.
Probably didn't have the legal right. She had the moral right that anybody does to not, be sexual, especially in a lustful situation.
We have to separate two things, especially when we get into Esther's role in all of this. We have to separate where we are today and what our mindset is today and what we think is proper today versus what was proper almost 2,500 years ago. The king was the king. What the king said was law. She had no legal right to refuse him, but she did have a moral right, as Alyssa was pointing out. So she refused. Why would his anger, why would he be so mad? I'm sorry? Well, he had too much to drink, which made him, which means that is the reason he broke his own laws and traditions and customs. I'm sorry? No one tells the king no, plus who is around him when she refuses? Everybody. He's having a party, and in front of everybody, he is now embarrassed. She could very well have forfeited her life. Now, then the king said to the wise men here, back in those days, wise men were also known as astrologers or different people like that, but in this particular instance, I don't think they're talking about astrologers. We're talking about Persia, and it appears as though that they were the ones that were probably lawyers, knowledgeable in law and customs. Because it says, then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. So he's asking all the wise men, the lawyers, those that know the laws and the customs, what she had done and what they need to, where they need to go from there. And the next unto him was, I'm not going to read these seven. They're the seven princes of the area. But in verse 15 it says, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law? Because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, and she came not. So this puts it in the perspective that, well, if the queen can disobey the queen, all us other women can do the same thing. So now they're making, they're going to have to do something about this. There you go. Good way to put it. Verse 18 says, likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard and of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. Now verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of Persians and Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. They could have requested her death, but they just requested her banishment. Now, there's some talk about the laws of the Medes and the Persians, how it can't be altered. But with the king, he could have made exceptions. He could have said, well, I was drunk and out of my mind, so I'm going to restore Vashti. We're going to take care of this a different way. Yes, Brother Golden.
Another reason that the king might not have had her killed was because she may have been pregnant with his son, Artaxerxes I. There's some scholars that think this could have been pretty close to her that lived.
Okay. I have read that also, but I don't know if that has much to do with it, but it's a definite possibility. But they requested her banishment, and then when the king decreed, when he shall be published throughout all the empire, for it was great, all the wives shall give to their husbands, both the great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan, sent letters and banished Queen Vashti. So, questions or comments on chapter 1? Yes, sir.
From the way it reads here and later on when the investor comes into the picture, it doesn't seem like this queen was the king's wife. She was just an elevated position of royalty. She was like the top of the others in his harem, I guess you could say. It doesn't appear to me that she's actually ever like married. Because she's gonna lose her position.
Well, I was going to wait till we got a little bit farther along, but since you raised the topic the way you did, you're absolutely correct. I said we was going to talk about harems a little bit later. What exactly is a harem?
Collection of women.
a collection of women, young women. As we go along, we'll find out that they were virgins. Women who are in harems, well, they start out as virgins, but then they go to the second house later, which we'll discuss a little bit. But in essence, they are enslaved. When the women go to the harem, they are no longer a free person to do what they want to. And we're going to find out as they go, well, it's not in Scripture, but when they go to the second house after the king has had a night with them, they're his property. And they can't be released, they can't marry, they can't do anything. They are a concubine unless the king decides to get rid of them. And one of them becomes the chief concubine, or is elevated to the position of number one, which is then referred to as the sultana, or the queen. So it's the chief concubine that is in the position of chief sultana, or the queen at that point. So, and normally in the harems, they looked for the people that didn't have, I won't say they went to the worst part of town to find the people, but they were not of nobility, because what nobility could refuse. They've got a position that they can, the parents can say no or buy the king off or something, but it's usually those of less means that are brought into that position. Questions, comments? Okay.
So you're saying that they were not married to him, yet they were exclusively his people. So that would seem to imply that Esther did something sinful by going along with this process. I have always understood it to be like Solomon. They were all married to him. It was not what God chose. It's not what our law is now, but God allowed it at that time, just as Abraham had multiple wives. Is that not the case of what's going on here?
Well, we're skipping ahead a little bit, but that's great, because this is just the way I have read and studied and looked at it. If you go along, Esther goes days without seeing months without seeing the king, and he still has all these other women that he can come in contact with. So, it is definitely not a normal marriage. She has been elevated to the chief position as the queen, and I guess you could call her number one consort. And that's why I said earlier that we have to separate what our knowledge is today and what we believe is the right and the wrong, and look at what was going on back then and what was their traditions and customs. And there has been a lot of discussion about whether Esther was doing improper things or proper things. The king is the king, and when she is taken into that harem, she is a slave to the king. She has no rights, legal. Solomon makes a distinction between wives and concubines. And in some countries, they can, even to this day, they can legally have 4 wives that are considered wives. There would be chief, second, tertiary, and fourth, and then any number of concubines to follow after that in the countries that allow harems to still exist. Brother Clarence, you had your hand, you was wanting to say something minutes ago.
Part of this was answered a while ago. What might be considered to be legal, the difference between the moral as far as what these people were going through, as far as did they have a marriage license, did they go through a ceremony, anything like that, what was moral as far as what they were doing.
because all we find out through here is that she was favored by everybody, including the king, and she was elevated to that position. And she spent her time, and just like Vashti had her own place to stay, it was not what we would consider a marriage today. Does that muddy it up for you? Yep. Hopefully we'll unmuddy it as we go along. Hopefully. Starting with chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what was decreed against her. Time has passed. Don't know exactly how much time, but now he sees what he's done. So then he says in verse 2, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And then it goes on in verse 3 to explain how he appoints people all over the territories to bring those virgins into Shushan, the palace. Now note, he's bringing them to the house of the women, unto the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. House number 1, they bring all the young maidens in that have been deemed to be good lookers and would be suitable for the king, and they bring them to the house of the women. There is no doubt that Haggai was a eunuch. Why do I say that? He was the keeper of the women. The king is not going to put somebody in charge of the women unless he is absolutely sure the women are going to be able to stay pure. And that's the most genteel way I can say that. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. It didn't say they had to marry for her to be queen. Just the one that pleases him will be elevated to that position. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. All right. So this puts Mordecai in the position of being in the palace. And we've already discussed Mordecai. And he brought up Hadassah, and that is Esther. Why would they change her name from Hadassah to Esther? Less Jewish. At this point, they didn't want anybody knowing that she was a Jewess. Yes? Daniel and his 3 friends' names were changed from Hebrew to Babylonian. Now in Shushan, the palace, we've gone through that. Now verse 7, when he brought up Esther, his uncle's daughter, we've gone through that, where he's a cousin. And it said the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her for his own daughter. So Mordecai apparently raised her correctly, because she has now reached a certain age that apparently we'd said earlier that she was orphaned when she was too young to take care of herself, and now she's of age that the king is going to be looking at her, so she's grown and matured. And it uses 2 words to describe her. it uses the word fair and beautiful. Is there a distinction between those two words? Beautiful inside and out. That is the best way I know to put it, because when I was in college, there was a young lady from Mississippi that was very beautiful. But everybody talked behind her back a little bit and said if she walked across campus with it raining, she had to put a clothespin on her nose to keep from drowning. What'd that mean? She was from a wealthy family in Mississippi. She was good looking, and she knew it. Other women that are not quite as beautiful on the outside would exceed her in beauty because they had inward beauty. So here it appears as though Esther was one of those women that was not only beautiful on the outside, but she knew how to conduct herself around people, because as we go along through here, everybody liked her. It's not necessary that people like beautiful people. People like people that are nice to be around. So she was fair, beautiful inside and out. Andrea don't know who I'm talking about, on the girl on campus, so we won't get into that. Verse 8, and it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also. Verse 9, the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, which things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Not everybody got maidens to take care of them. So here, Haggai was very impressed with her and was doing everything that he could to help her along. Reminiscent of Joseph, absolutely. And Esther had not shown her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So people still didn't know that she was Jewish. Now, pause there for a minute, because I meant to do this at the very outset of the class and I forgot it. How many times is the word God used in the book of Esther? Oh, 0. What's important about that is, to me anyway, that it shows in the book of Esther how God is working sort of behind the scenes. He's never called on directly, but there's always God in the background working along the way here. So verse 11, Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house, and this is why I say that odds are he was a eunuch, because nobody's going to get that close that can do anything to the women. To know how Esther did and what should become of her. Now when every maid's turn was coming to the king, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for purification and etc. Verse 13, then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king. So the night that they were to go to the king, they could get anything they wanted to take with them. Any clothing, perfume, jewelry, whatever. But verse 14, in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women. All right? house of the women, now the second house of the women. Don't want to be crude in telling this, but what's the difference between the two houses, the first house and the second house? They're not virgins anymore. They're now concubines. They now belong to the king. Can't go out and get married, can't do anything without the king's permission. And now they're put in the custody of Shoashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king and no more, except the king delighted in her and that she were called by name. She goes into that second house, and she may stay in that house forever without ever coming in the king's presence again. Or if the king likes her, he may call her in for a visit. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, appointed. So Esther was saying, whatever you think I need, you give me, and that's it. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked on her. And so Esther was taken unto the king Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now here we're getting down to we can go some timelining. 7th year of his reign. When was his first party? 4 years before that. So it's through this process, it's taken about 4 years. Well, 3 years before the way the Jews count. Okay? So apparently he sulked for a while before he really missed Vashti, missed having a queen, because then they started, I guess, one a night for however long until it came down to Esther. They were purified for a year, which backs things up. So he probably went a year or so and then made the decision. But now we're 4 years into this. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. This gets back to Alyssa's question. Nothing is said about marriage. He's made her queen. He's made her number one of the concubines. Then okay, I'm going to play the devil here for a minute. Okay?
Earlier in the chapter, doesn't specify as in Daniel where she refused any of the food from the king's palace, even though she's a Jew. So I don't think they make that distinction. It's a different time, different. God's got her there for a different reason.
Did you hear that? Okay.
There were some senses she was looked at as far as being a wife, because with the refusal of Vashti to do what she did, some sense in which she was looked at just as Esther would be.
Okay, and I'm in agreement with you. Like I said, I'm playing the devil here. But what distinguishes then a wife's position? If she still lived in the house with the concubines, and she was queen, and she was married, but the king, any night he wanted to or any day he wanted to, he could call on up to however many he had. What distinguishes, what legally makes the difference between whether or not she is technically married or technically not married?
I would say she's had the crown placed upon her head, so that makes her different.
At the crown on her head that makes her different, she's number one, no doubt about it.
And every woman in both of those houses is the king's property.
Right.
Whatever has happened, yet they're not allowed to be with anybody else. They're bound by slavery or not, effectively.
We got halfway through. I make no apology. I knew this was going to happen, but I'm just going to take we're going to pick up here next week and continue. But this is one thing to me that makes this book so intriguing and why I like it so much. Thank y'all.